Marcus Johnson stood in the boardroom of Thompson Industries, watching 43 employees pack their personal belongings into cardboard boxes. The company layoffs had been brutal, but Marcus wasn't among those leaving. He was the one who had recommended half of these terminations to the CEO. 6 months ago, Marcus had been just another face in the accounting department. Today, he was the youngest senior manager in company history. The transformation hadn't happened by accident. It was the result of carefully studying and applying principles that most people either don't know or are too afraid to use. Marcus had discovered these truths the hard way, starting with a humiliating moment that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning when his supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, called him into her office. She was holding a report he'd submitted the previous week. "This analysis is completely wrong, Marcus," she said, not bothering to look up from her computer screen. "The numbers don't add up, and your recommendations would cost us millions." Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment. He'd spent 3 weeks on that report, working late nights and weekends. "I double-checked everything," he said quietly. Janet finally looked at him, her expression cold and dismissive. "Clearly, you didn't check well enough. I'm reassigning this project to Kevin. He understands the complexity better." Kevin Martinez was Marcus's colleague, someone who'd started the same week as Marcus, but somehow always seemed to get the better assignments. As Marcus walked back to his desk, he overheard Kevin talking to another coworker. "Poor Marcus," Kevin was saying, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "He tries so hard, but he just doesn't have what it takes for the big projects." That night, Marcus sat in his small apartment, staring at a stack of business books he'd been meaning to read. One caught his attention, a worn copy of the 48 Laws of Power that his college roommate had left behind. He'd always thought it looked too aggressive, too manipulative. But after today's humiliation, he was desperate for answers. As he read through the first few chapters, Marcus realized he'd been playing the game of office politics completely wrong. He'd been honest to a fault, helpful to everyone, and trusting that good work would speak for itself. What he discovered was that power operates by different rules entirely. The first brutal truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Never outshine the master. Marcus realized he'd been making a critical mistake. In his eagerness to impress, he'd been presenting ideas that made his supervisors look bad. His innovative cost-saving proposals had highlighted inefficiencies in Janet's department. His detailed reports showed gaps in the existing systems that Janet was responsible for maintaining. Instead of appreciating his efforts, Janet saw him as a threat. She wasn't trying to help him grow. She was protecting her own position by keeping him in a subordinate role. The next day, Marcus began his transformation. Instead of challenging Janet's methods directly, he started asking questions that led her to discover problems on her own. When he found errors in departmental processes, he presented them as concerns rather than solutions, allowing Janet to take credit for fixing them. "Janet," he would say, "I noticed something in the quarterly reports that might need your expert opinion. Do you think there might be a more efficient approach to this process?" Within 2 weeks, Janet was praising Marcus as her most insightful team member. She began bringing him to senior meetings, introducing him as someone who really understands the nuances of our operations. But Marcus was just getting started. The second truth he learned was equally powerful: court attention at all costs. But this didn't mean being loud or obnoxious. It meant being strategically visible in ways that mattered. Marcus studied the patterns of company communication. He noticed that the CEO, Robert Thompson, always arrived at the office at exactly 7:15 a.m. and took the same route to his corner office. Marcus began arriving at 7:10 a.m., positioning himself in locations where brief, natural interactions could occur. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Marcus would say, carrying a stack of reports that suggested he was already hard at work while others were still commuting. "Early bird today, Marcus," Thompson would reply, impressed by the dedication. These 30-second conversations planted seeds. Thompson began to notice Marcus's name on reports and project assignments. When Janet mentioned Marcus's contributions in meetings, Thompson already had a positive impression to build upon. The third truth Marcus discovered was perhaps the most dangerous: conceal your intentions. He learned that telegraphing your moves gives opponents time to counter them. When Marcus decided he wanted Kevin's position as senior analyst, he didn't announce his ambitions or compete directly. Instead, Marcus began a subtle campaign of positioning. He volunteered for projects that Kevin typically handled, not to steal them, but to assist with expertise Kevin lacked. Marcus had discovered that Kevin's strength was in presentation and networking, but his analytical skills were actually quite weak. When Kevin struggled with a complex financial model, Marcus offered to help. But instead of fixing Kevin's work, Marcus asked probing questions that exposed the flaws in Kevin's understanding. "Kevin, this revenue projection seems optimistic," Marcus would say during team meetings. "Did you factor in the seasonal adjustments we discussed last quarter?" Kevin would fumble for an answer, clearly not having considered that variable. Marcus would then offer to collaborate on refining the model, ultimately producing work that showcased his superior analytical abilities while maintaining the appearance of team support. The fourth truth became clear through observation: always say less than necessary. Marcus noticed that the most powerful people in the company were often the quietest in meetings. They listened more than they spoke, and when they did speak, their words carried weight. Marcus transformed his communication style. Instead of offering multiple suggestions in brainstorming sessions, he would listen to all proposals first, then offer one carefully considered insight that often became the foundation for the final decision. After hearing everyone's input, he would say, "I think there's an underlying factor we haven't addressed." Then, he would present a perspective that reframed the entire discussion. This approach made his contributions memorable and valuable. People began to wait for Marcus's input before making final decisions. The fifth truth required Marcus to confront his own assumptions about fairness and loyalty. So much depends on reputation. Guard it with your life. Marcus realized that in the corporate world, perception often matters more than reality. He began carefully managing his professional image. When Kevin made mistakes, Marcus didn't point them out publicly. Instead, he would privately document the errors while publicly offering support. This created a pattern where Marcus appeared loyal and helpful, while Kevin's incompetence became increasingly apparent to supervisors. Marcus also began associating himself with successful projects while distancing himself from potential failures. When a risky initiative was proposed, Marcus would express thoughtful concerns rather than enthusiastic support. If the project succeeded despite his concerns, he would credit the team's hard work. If it failed, his documented reservations positioned him as someone with good judgment. The sixth truth was particularly challenging for Marcus to accept: use the surrender tactic, transform weakness into power. When Janet assigned him to a project that was clearly designed to fail, a cost reduction initiative with impossible timeline constraints, Marcus didn't protest or complain. Instead, he embraced the assignment with apparent enthusiasm. He meticulously documented every obstacle and resource limitation he encountered. When the project inevitably failed to meet its unrealistic goals, Marcus presented a comprehensive analysis that demonstrated exactly why failure was inevitable from the start. While we couldn't achieve the original timeline, he reported to senior management, this analysis has revealed systemic inefficiencies that, if addressed, could deliver even greater cost savings than originally projected. His failure became a roadmap for organizational improvement, and Marcus was assigned to lead the follow-up initiative with proper resources and realistic timelines. The seventh truth revolutionized how Marcus approached workplace relationships. Get others to do the work for you, but always take credit. This wasn't about stealing credit unfairly, but about becoming the central coordinator of successful efforts. Marcus began positioning himself as the liaison between different departments on cross-functional projects. He would gather input from various specialists, synthesize their contributions, and present comprehensive solutions to senior management. Based on insights from our marketing, operations, and finance teams, he would report, "I've developed an integrated approach that addresses all stakeholder concerns." While he acknowledged the contributions of others in detailed project documentation, he became the face of successful initiatives in executive presentations. The eighth truth required Marcus to study human psychology more carefully. Make other people come to you. Use bait if necessary. Instead of constantly offering help or suggestions, Marcus began creating situations where others needed his expertise. He developed specialized knowledge in emerging financial regulations that affected the company's operations. When colleagues needed guidance in this area, they naturally came to Marcus. He became the go-to resource for a critical area of compliance, making himself indispensable. The ninth truth was perhaps the most sophisticated. Win through your actions, never through argument. Marcus learned that trying to convince people through logic and debate was far less effective than demonstrating superior results. When Kevin proposed a market analysis methodology that Marcus knew was flawed, he didn't argue against it in the meeting. Instead, he quietly prepared his own analysis using a different approach. When Kevin's methodology produced inconclusive results, Marcus was ready with clear, actionable insights that solved the actual business problem. The final truth that transformed Marcus's career was the most counterintuitive: assume formlessness. He learned that being too predictable made him easy to counter or dismiss. By varying his approaches and maintaining flexibility in his methods, Marcus became much harder for competitors like Kevin to undermine. Sometimes Marcus would be the collaborative team player, other times the decisive problem solver. Sometimes he would defer to authority, other times he would take initiative. This adaptability kept others off balance and unable to categorize or dismiss him easily. The transformation took 8 months. When the senior analyst position opened up, Marcus was the obvious choice. Kevin had been steadily marginalized as his limitations became apparent to management. Janet had come to rely on Marcus so heavily that she actively recommended his promotion. But Marcus's real breakthrough came when Robert Thompson approached him directly about joining the senior management team. Marcus, Thompson said during one of their brief morning encounters, "I've been watching your work on the efficiency initiatives. You have a strategic perspective that I think could be valuable at the executive level." Marcus had achieved something remarkable. He had transformed himself from an overlooked employee into a rising executive without making enemies or burning bridges. The people he had maneuvered around didn't even realize they had been outplayed. As Marcus cleaned out his old desk to move to his new corner office, he reflected on the brutal truths he had learned. These weren't evil manipulations or unethical tactics. They were simply the hidden rules that govern how power actually works in human organizations. Most people never learn these rules because they're uncomfortable with the idea that success requires strategic thinking about human nature. They prefer to believe that hard work and good intentions are enough. Marcus had learned that while these qualities are important, they're not sufficient in competitive environments. The strength that others pray you never unlock isn't supernatural or mystical. It's simply the willingness to see and work with human nature as it actually exists, rather than as we wish it were. It's the power to influence outcomes through understanding psychology, timing, perception, and positioning. Marcus looked around his new office, knowing that he was just beginning to understand what was possible when you stop playing by rules that don't actually exist and start operating according to the principles that govern real human behavior. The 43 employees who had lost their jobs weren't incompetent or unlucky. They simply hadn't understood the game they were playing. Marcus had learned the rules, and that knowledge had changed everything. As he unpacked his belongings in his new office, Marcus wondered how many other people were sitting in cubicles right now, wondering why their hard work wasn't being rewarded, why their good ideas weren't being heard, why their careers had stalled despite their best efforts. They were playing checkers in a chess world, using elementary strategies in an advanced game. The strength they needed wasn't physical or intellectual superiority. It was the psychological sophistication to understand and work with the hidden dynamics that actually drive human organizations. Marcus had unlocked that strength, and It had transformed not just his career, but his entire understanding of how the world really works. Elena Vasquez stood at the podium of the town hall meeting, facing 200 angry residents. 6 months ago, she had been an unknown city council candidate with no political experience. Tonight, she was about to announce her candidacy for mayor against the most powerful political machine in the county. The current mayor, David Sterling, had held office for 12 years. His family had controlled local politics for 3 generations. He had the backing of every major business, the police union, the teachers' union, and a campaign war chest of over $2 million. Elena had $37,000 and a group of volunteers who met in her garage. By every conventional measure, Elena's campaign was doomed before it started. But Elena had spent the past year studying power dynamics, and she understood something that David Sterling's advisors didn't. In politics, as in business, the appearance of inevitability can be an opponent's greatest weakness. Elena's journey to this moment had begun with a personal crisis that forced her to learn how power really works. 2 years earlier, her teenage son Miguel had been wrongfully arrested during a traffic stop. The charges were eventually dropped, but not before Miguel spent 3 days in juvenile detention, and Elena had to hire a lawyer she couldn't afford. When Elena tried to file a complaint about the officer's conduct, she was shuffled between departments, told to fill out forms that led nowhere, and ultimately informed that the incident didn't meet the criteria for disciplinary action. The officer remained on duty, and Elena learned that he had a history of similar complaints that had all been quietly dismissed. Elena's first instinct was to accept the system's verdict and move on. She was a single mother working as a hospital administrator. She didn't have time for political fights, and she certainly didn't have the connections or resources to challenge powerful institutions. But something about the casual dismissal of her concerns triggered a deeper anger. Elena began researching similar cases and discovered a pattern of abuse that affected dozens of families in her community. The difference was that most of these families, like hers, lacked the political influence to demand accountability. Elena's transformation began when she attended a city council meeting to voice her concerns during the public comment period. She had prepared a 3-minute speech outlining the pattern of police misconduct and requesting an independent investigation. But when her turn came to speak, Elena was cut off after 90 seconds by Council Chairman Harold Morrison, who claimed her comments were too specific and might interfere with ongoing personnel matters. "Ma'am," Morrison said with patronizing patience, "we appreciate your civic engagement, but these are complex issues that require careful consideration by qualified professionals." Elena sat down, humiliated and frustrated. She watched as the meeting continued with discussions of park maintenance budgets and zoning variances. The councilors seemed to exist in a bubble, disconnected from the real problems affecting their constituents. That night, Elena made a decision that would change her life. Instead of accepting her powerlessness, she would learn how to acquire power. She spent the next 3 months studying political strategy, campaign management, and, most importantly, the hidden dynamics that determine who really controls local government. The first brutal truth Elena discovered was that most political power isn't held by elected officials. It's controlled by a network of business leaders, union bosses, party officials, and long-term bureaucrats who maintain influence regardless of election outcomes. Elena mapped this network meticulously. She attended public meetings, studied campaign finance reports, and traced the connections between major donors and policy decisions. What she found was a system designed to maintain the status quo while creating the appearance of democratic participation. David Sterling wasn't really the power in local government. He was a figurehead managed by a group of wealthy developers led by construction magnate Richard Blackwood. Sterling made decisions that benefited Blackwood's projects while Blackwood ensured Sterling's campaigns were well-funded and his opposition was neutralized. The second truth Elena learned was that this system maintained control through the illusion of inevitability. Potential challengers were discouraged by the perception that opposing the machine was futile. Campaign consultants refused to work for opposition candidates, predicting certain defeat. Local media treated Sterling's re-election as a foregone conclusion. But Elena recognized this as psychological warfare rather than political reality. The machine was powerful, but it was also complacent. It had grown lazy from years of unopposed control. Elena's strategy began with a principle she'd learned from studying successful insurgent campaigns: enter at unexpected points. Instead of challenging Sterling directly on traditional political issues, Elena focused on a problem the machine had ignored because it didn't affect wealthy donors. The city's water system was failing. Residents in Elena's neighborhood frequently experienced outages, discolored water, and boil water advisories. The infrastructure was 40 years old and desperately needed replacement. But upgrading the system would require significant rate increases or new taxes, making it politically unpopular. Sterling's administration had been kicking the problem down the road for years, commissioning studies and forming committees while the situation deteriorated. Elena realized this was her opening. She began attending neighborhood association meetings, not to announce her political ambitions, but to listen to residents' concerns about water quality and reliability. She discovered that the problem was far worse than publicly acknowledged and affected over 10,000 households across the city. Elena spent 4 months documenting water quality violations, mapping infrastructure failures, and building relationships with affected residents. She didn't present herself as a political candidate, but as a concerned citizen working to understand and address a serious public health issue. The third truth Elena learned was the power of asymmetric warfare. She couldn't match Sterling's financial resources, but she could outwork his campaign on the ground level. While Sterling relied on expensive television advertisements and professional consultants, Elena built a grassroots network of volunteers who had personal stakes in the issues she was addressing. Elena's volunteer coordinator was Maria Santos, a nurse who lived in the neighborhood most affected by water problems. Maria had 3 children and understood intimately how water outages disrupted family life. She recruited other mothers who were equally frustrated with the city's neglect of basic infrastructure. These volunteers didn't just distribute campaign literature. They conducted detailed surveys of water quality issues in their neighborhoods, creating a comprehensive database of problems that Sterling's administration had failed to address. Elena learned the fourth truth from studying successful political insurgencies: make the enemy live up to their own rules. Sterling had built his reputation as a competent administrator who kept the city running smoothly. Elena's water infrastructure campaign exposed this image as a facade. When Sterling claimed that water problems were isolated incidents being addressed through normal maintenance procedures, Elena was ready with documentation showing hundreds of service calls, dozens of boil water advisories, and systematic neglect of repairs in lower-income neighborhoods. The fifth truth was about timing and momentum. Elena waited until Sterling's vulnerabilities were most exposed before announcing her candidacy. She scheduled her announcement for the day after a major water main break that left 5,000 residents without service for 18 hours. Standing in front of the broken water main with frustrated residents behind her, Elena presented her candidacy not as a political ambition, but as a necessary response to governmental failure. The people in charge have had 12 years to fix these problems, she said to local news cameras. Instead, they've chosen to ignore them. It's time for leadership that puts residents' basic needs ahead of special interests. Elena's sixth insight was about narrative control. Instead of allowing Sterling to define the campaign around traditional political issues where he had advantages, Elena kept the focus on competence and accountability around basic services. When Sterling tried to shift discussion to economic development and job creation, Elena would acknowledge the importance of these issues while pointing out that economic growth was meaningless if residents couldn't count on clean, reliable water service. "You can't build a strong economy on a failing foundation," became one of Elena's most effective talking points. The seventh truth Elena discovered was about coalition building across traditional political lines. The water infrastructure crisis affected conservative and progressive neighborhoods equally. Elena found she could build support among voters who disagreed on most political issues, but shared frustration with basic service failures. Elena's campaign volunteers included Tea Party conservatives angry about government incompetence and progressive activists concerned about environmental justice. These groups had never worked together before, but Elena's focus on governmental accountability provided common ground. Elena learned her 8th lesson by observing Sterling's campaign mistakes. The incumbent had grown so accustomed to easy victories that he didn't know how to respond to serious opposition. His early campaign strategy assumed Elena would be a minor nuisance easily dismissed with superior resources. Sterling's first television advertisement attacked Elena's lack of political experience, describing her as unqualified for the complex challenges of municipal government. This message backfired because it reinforced Elena's narrative that the current administration's qualifications had produced 12 years of infrastructure neglect. Elena's response advertisement featured Maria Santos and other residents describing their personal experiences with water outages. Elena may not be a professional politician, Maria said into the camera, but she understands our problems because she lives them every day. The ninth truth Elena learned was about the power of moral authority. By consistently focusing on residents' basic needs rather than personal advancement, Elena claimed the moral high ground in the campaign. This made attacks against her seem petty and self-serving. When Blackwood's development company funded attack ads questioning Elena's financial management experience, Elena responded by releasing her complete financial records and challenging Sterling to do the same. She also pointed out that the attacks were funded by the same company that had received millions in city contracts while water infrastructure deteriorated. Elena's final strategic insight was about persistence and escalation. As her campaign gained momentum, Sterling's machine attempted to neutralize her through intimidation and discouragement. Elena received warnings that her city employment could be affected by her political activities. Anonymous flyers appeared in her neighborhood, making false claims about her background. Rather than being deterred, Elena used these tactics as evidence of the corruption she was fighting against. She documented each incident and presented them as proof that the current power structure would resort to unethical methods to maintain control. 3 weeks before the election, Elena's campaign received its biggest break when a water main break in an affluent neighborhood caused a sewage backup that flooded several expensive homes. The incident could no longer be dismissed as a problem affecting only lower-income areas. Sterling's response to the crisis was bureaucratic and tone-deaf. He announced the formation of another committee to study infrastructure improvements while residents dealt with contaminated basements and undrinkable water. Elena's response was immediate and practical. She organized volunteer crews to help affected residents with cleanup efforts and connected them with independent contractors who could address immediate health and safety concerns. The contrast was stark. Sterling offered committees and studies while Elena provided actual help. Local news coverage showed Elena in work clothes helping residents pump out flooded basements, while Sterling appeared at a campaign fundraiser hosted by Blackwood. On election night, Elena won with 56% of the vote. She had overcome a 12-to-1 funding disadvantage, defeated a 3-generation political dynasty, and built a coalition that crossed every demographic and ideological line in the city. But Elena's victory wasn't just about winning an election. It demonstrated that ordinary people could acquire and effectively use political power when they understood how the system actually worked rather than how it was supposed to work. Elena had learned that power isn't distributed according to official organizational charts or democratic ideals. It flows to those who understand human psychology, master timing and positioning, and maintain focus on objectives that matter to people's daily lives. Most importantly, Elena had discovered that the greatest strength others pray you never unlock isn't the ability to manipulate or dominate. It's the capacity to see through comfortable illusions and work effectively with reality as it exists. The night after her election victory, Elena sat in the same garage where her volunteer meetings had started 18 months earlier. She was surrounded by the same people who had believed in her campaign when it seemed impossible. "What we did here," Elena told her supporters, "proves that power isn't about money or connections or family names. Real power comes from understanding people and organizing them around solutions to problems they actually face." Elena looked around the garage at the faces of people who had transformed themselves from passive victims of governmental neglect into effective agents of political change. They had unlocked a strength that the established power structure had assumed would remain forever dormant. Tomorrow, Elena would begin the work of actually governing a city whose infrastructure problems were even worse than her campaign had revealed. But tonight, she celebrated something more important than winning an election. She had proven that ordinary people could learn and apply the same principles of power that had previously been available only to wealthy elites and professional politicians. The strength they had unlocked wasn't just Elena's personal achievement. It was a template that could be replicated by anyone willing to study how power actually works and commit to the disciplined application of that knowledge. Elena's transformation from powerless citizen to elected mayor demonstrated the most dangerous truth of all. When ordinary people learn to use power effectively, they become capable of challenging and defeating systems that have maintained control for generations through the simple expectation that such challenges would never come. Dr. Sarah Chun stood in the emergency room of Metropolitan Hospital, watching her colleague Dr. James Hartford receive another award for medical innovation. It was the third recognition he'd gotten this year for work that Sarah had actually performed. But tonight, that was about to change forever. For 8 years, Sarah had been the invisible force behind some of the hospital's most significant medical breakthroughs. She was the surgeon who developed new techniques, the researcher who published groundbreaking studies, and the teacher who trained the next generation of doctors. But she was also a woman in a male-dominated institution, and her contributions were systematically minimized, stolen, or ignored. Dr. Hartford, the department chief, had built his reputation by appropriating the work of junior doctors, particularly women and minorities who lacked the political power to challenge him. His method was sophisticated. He would assign promising projects to talented subordinates, then gradually insert himself into the process until he became the lead researcher and primary author on resulting publications. Sarah had watched this pattern destroy the careers of several promising doctors. But unlike her predecessors, Sarah had spent the last year studying the hidden dynamics that governed academic medicine. Tonight, she was about to deploy everything she had learned. Sarah's awakening had begun 2 years earlier during a case that should have established her reputation as one of the country's leading cardiac surgeons. A 6-year-old girl named Amanda Rodriguez had been brought to the emergency room with a complex heart defect that traditional surgical approaches couldn't address. Sarah had spent 3 weeks developing an innovative surgical technique that combined elements from different specialties. The operation was a complete success, saving Amanda's life and establishing a new standard of care for similar cases. Dr. Hartford had watched the surgery from the observation deck, taking detailed notes. When Sarah presented the case at the monthly department meeting, Hartford interrupted her presentation to add his own insights and improvements to her technique. Within 6 months, Hartford was traveling to medical conferences presenting his surgical innovation to audiences around the world. Sarah's name appeared nowhere in his presentations, and her role in developing the technique was reduced to a footnote crediting her as a capable surgical resident who had assisted with implementation. The final insult came when the American Heart Association gave Hartford their Innovator of the Year award for the technique Sarah had created. Sarah watched from the audience as Hartford accepted the honor without mentioning her contribution even once. That night, Sarah made a decision that would reshape her career and expose the corrupt power structure that governed academic medicine. Instead of accepting her role as Hartford's invisible contributor, she would learn to play the game better than he did. Sarah's first insight came from studying how Hartford had accumulated power within the hospital system. He hadn't achieved his position through superior medical skills or groundbreaking research. Instead, he had mastered the art of institutional politics while maintaining plausible deniability about his theft of others' work. Hartford's power base consisted of three elements: control over research funding, influence over promotional decisions, and relationships with senior administrators who didn't understand medical research well enough to evaluate claims of authorship or innovation. Sarah realized that challenging Hartford directly would be futile. He controlled too many aspects of departmental operations, and his version of events would always be accepted over hers by administrators who relied on his judgment for technical matters they couldn't evaluate independently. Instead, Sarah developed a strategy based on a principle she learned from studying institutional power dynamics: create parallel authority structures that bypass existing hierarchies. Sarah's first move was to establish relationships with doctors and researchers outside Metropolitan Hospital. She began attending medical conferences not as Hartford's subordinate, but as an independent researcher presenting her own work. This required careful planning. Sarah couldn't present research that Hartford had already claimed without creating obvious conflicts. Instead, she focused on developing new projects that Hartford wouldn't be able to appropriate because she controlled every aspect of their development and implementation. Sarah's breakthrough came when she identified a research opportunity that Hartford would consider beneath his attention. The hospital's patient satisfaction scores had been declining, particularly in the cardiac surgery department. Administrator complaints about patient complaints were becoming a source of embarrassment for the hospital. Sarah recognized this as an opportunity to demonstrate leadership on an issue that Hartford would avoid because it seemed like administrative busywork rather than prestigious medical research. Sarah spent 3 months conducting detailed interviews with cardiac surgery patients and their families. She discovered that the primary sources of dissatisfaction weren't medical outcomes, which were excellent, but communication problems and lack of emotional support during the treatment process. Sarah developed a comprehensive patient care protocol that addressed these concerns through improved communication training for medical staff, structured family consultation processes, and follow-up support programs that continued after discharge. The results were dramatic. Patient satisfaction scores in cardiac surgery improved by 40% within 6 months. More importantly, Sarah had established herself as a leader in an area that was becoming increasingly important to hospital administrators worried about public relations and regulatory compliance. Sarah's second strategic move was to document everything meticulously. Unlike her previous work, which Hartford had been able to appropriate because it existed mainly in informal discussions and departmental presentations, Sarah's patient care research was thoroughly documented with timestamps, video recordings, and independent verification. When Sarah presented her findings to the hospital's Quality Improvement Committee, she made sure that her presentation was recorded and that copies of all supporting materials were distributed to committee members beforehand. This made it impossible for Hartford to later claim credit for her work without obvious deception. Sarah learned her third crucial lesson by observing how Hartford maintained his reputation despite his pattern of intellectual theft. Hartford was skilled at associating himself with successful projects while distancing himself from potential failures. Sarah decided to reverse this dynamic. Sarah began volunteering for challenging cases that other doctors avoided because of high risk factors. She took on patients with complex conditions where traditional treatments had failed, situations where Hartford wouldn't want to risk his reputation on uncertain outcomes. These cases allowed Sarah to demonstrate her surgical skills and innovative thinking without Hartford's interference. When she succeeded with difficult cases, the entire medical staff took notice. When she occasionally experienced setbacks, she used them as learning opportunities that enhanced her reputation for honesty and continuous improvement. Sarah's fourth insight was about the power of external validation. Hartford's authority within Metropolitan Hospital was largely based on his reputation in the broader medical community. Sarah realized she needed to establish her own external credibility to neutralize Hartford's institutional advantages. Sarah began submitting her research to medical journals independently, listing herself as the primary author and including detailed acknowledgments of any collaboration or assistance she had received. This created a published record of her contributions that Hartford couldn't retroactively modify. More importantly, Sarah started building relationships with researchers at other institutions who were working on similar problems. She shared her techniques and insights freely, establishing herself as a recognized expert in patient care optimization and innovative surgical approaches. These external relationships became crucial when Sarah received an invitation to present her patient care research at the International Conference on Medical Quality Improvement. This was exactly the type of prestigious platform that Hartford typically monopolized for departmental representatives. When Hartford learned about Sarah's invitation, he attempted to insert himself into her presentation by claiming that her work was part of a larger departmental initiative that he supervised. Sarah was ready for this move. Sarah had anticipated Hartford's interference and prepared accordingly. She had documentation showing that her research had been conducted independently, during her personal time, using resources she had acquired through her own grant applications. She also had statements from external collaborators confirming her role as the primary researcher and developer of the innovations she would be presenting. When Hartford demanded to review and approve Sarah's presentation materials, Sarah politely declined, explaining that the conference organizers had specifically invited her based on her independently published research, and that modifying her presentation to include unrelated departmental activities would compromise its focus and effectiveness. Hartford was trapped. He couldn't forbid Sarah from accepting the invitation without appearing to suppress her professional development. He also couldn't force his way into her presentation without admitting that he hadn't been involved in the original research. Sarah's presentation at the international conference was a breakthrough moment. She received standing ovations for both her surgical innovations and her patient care protocols. More importantly, she was approached by researchers and department heads from leading medical institutions around the world. One of these conversations led to Sarah's fifth strategic insight: the power of alternative opportunities. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the department head at Johns Hopkins, was impressed enough with Sarah's work to offer her a research fellowship that would allow her to develop her innovations further while establishing her independence from Hartford's influence. Sarah realized that accepting the fellowship would accomplish something that direct confrontation with Hartford never could. It would demonstrate to Metropolitan Hospital's administrators that she was a valuable asset being recruited by competing institutions. Sarah carefully orchestrated the timing of her fellowship announcement. She waited until Hartford was scheduled to present his annual department report to the hospital board, a presentation that typically highlighted his contributions to the institution's prestige and research productivity. The day before Hartford's presentation, Sarah submitted her resignation letter and announced her acceptance of the Johns Hopkins Fellowship. Her letter included detailed documentation of her contributions to the department's research output, with specific emphasis on work that Hartford had previously claimed credit for. Sarah's resignation created an immediate crisis for Hartford. The department board began asking pointed questions about the continuity of research projects and the retention of talented researchers. For the first time, administrators started examining the actual contributions of individual doctors rather than simply accepting Hartford's summaries. The investigation that followed Sarah's departure revealed the full extent of Hartford's systematic appropriation of subordinates' work. Other doctors, emboldened by Sarah's example, began coming forward with their own accounts of intellectual theft and credit appropriation. Within 3 months, Hartford was forced to resign amid a scandal that brought national attention to the problem of research exploitation in academic medicine. The hospital implemented new policies to ensure proper attribution of research contributions and established an ombudsman office to investigate future claims of academic misconduct. But Sarah's victory extended far beyond Hartford's downfall. At Johns Hopkins, Sarah was able to publish her complete research findings under her own name and establish herself as a leading authority on both surgical innovation and patient care optimization. More importantly, Sarah's success inspired other women and minority doctors who had been trapped in similar situations. She became a mentor and advocate for young researchers, teaching them the same principles of institutional navigation that had enabled her own transformation. Sarah's story demonstrated that the strength others pray you never unlock isn't about becoming ruthless or manipulative. It's about learning to operate effectively within systems that weren't designed to support your success. The brutal truths Sarah had learned were really insights about human nature and institutional behavior that most people never acquire because they're uncomfortable acknowledging how organizations actually function versus how they're supposed to function. Sarah had discovered that talent and hard work aren't enough to succeed in complex institutions. You also need strategic thinking about power dynamics, careful documentation of your contributions, external validation of your expertise, and the courage to create alternative pathways when existing structures block your advancement. 3 years after leaving Metropolitan Hospital, Sarah returned as the new department head of cardiac surgery. Her first act was to implement mentorship programs and research attribution protocols that would prevent future exploitation of junior doctors. But Sarah's real achievement wasn't her individual success or even the systemic changes she implemented. She had proven that ordinary people could learn to navigate and ultimately transform institutional power structures that had previously seemed immutable. The strength that others pray you never unlock is the ability to see through organizational facades and understand how power actually flows through human institutions. Most people never develop this understanding because they're trained to accept official explanations of how systems work rather than observing how they actually operate. Sarah had learned to distinguish between the formal rules that institutions advertise and the informal dynamics that determine actual outcomes. She had mastered the art of working with human nature as it exists rather than as idealized versions suggest it should exist. Standing in her new office as department head, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible contributor to institutional leader. The transformation hadn't required her to become someone different. Instead, it had required her to understand and strategically apply principles of human behavior that were always present but rarely acknowledged. Sarah looked at the awards on her wall, recognitions she had earned through her own documented contributions rather than institutional appropriation. But more satisfying were the thank you notes from young doctors she had mentored, people who were now applying the same principles to build their own successful careers. The strength that others pray you never unlock isn't a mysterious force or supernatural ability. It's simply the wisdom to understand how human institutions actually function and the discipline to apply that understanding strategically and ethically. Sarah had unlocked that strength, and in doing so, she had not only transformed her own career, but created pathways for others to achieve similar transformations. The brutal truths she had learned weren't weapons for destruction, but tools for construction, ways to build success within systems that had previously blocked advancement for talented people who didn't understand the hidden rules governing institutional power. Most importantly, Sarah had discovered that these principles weren't secrets available only to a privileged few. They were patterns of human behavior that anyone could learn and apply, provided they were willing to observe carefully, think strategically, and act with both courage and integrity.